Well, fellas, the day you've been waiting for is finally here. Yes, we'll be taking a look today at the brand new LG 4K 240Hz/480Hz dual mode 32-inch monitor that is potentially the most contentious monitor or display in general that's ever been released. It seems like people either love this monitor or they hate it, and I feel like there's a lot of gaps in the information that's been presented on this monitor, which is why today we are going to be taking an extremely deep dive into this monitor to try and determine, is it worth its extremely high price tag of roughly $1,400, or are you really just better off buying a Quantum Dot OLED 4K 32-inch 240Hz monitor instead for potentially a lot lower depending on the model that you choose and is in stock? Well, let's go ahead and find out by taking an unbiased and unsponsored review of this brand new monitor. All right, so the LG dual mode 32GS95UE-B, these names just keep getting better, which was purchased by me out of pocket at the request of Patreon supporters who do help fund these reviews, so thank you for that, is a 32-inch 3840 by 2160 240Hz at 4K and 480Hz at 1080p 16 by 9 MLA WOLED V3 panel with an alleged response time of 0.03 milliseconds. Yes, it does support G-Sync and FreeSync, and it has a VESA Display HDR True Black 400 certification. Now, the overall design I do think looks really good from the front, and it does feel very good as well, but I'm not a huge fan of the curved gamery design on the back. Now, this stand itself is actually great. It does not take up too much room and does everything you'd want it to, except for rotate in one direction for some reason, and it is 100 by 100 millimeter standard VESA mount compatible. Now, if you want to know about the ports, pause if you need to, but be aware, regardless of whether or not you use HDMI or DisplayPort, it does not have DisplayPort 2.1, so you will have to use DisplayStream compression. We're gonna have to get used to those black screens, but coming in at a price of $1399.99 and apparently coming with a 2-year parts and labor warranty, and I believe at least 1 year of burn-in, but maybe 2, don't quote me on that. Is it too high and I made a big mistake purchasing it, or was the mistake that I waited this long and it's worth every penny? Well, that really depends on how well it performs, and to find that out, let's first start off with the color. Now, my first impressions are, in SDR, it's actually really good. It does look fairly accurate out of the box, and I do trust this to give me relatively good skin tones while still giving you all the colors that you want, but in HDR, it is gonna fall short of Quantum Dot OLED, as, yeah, I believe what's happening is the white subpixel can wash out some very bright colors, but it's really gonna depend on the scene whether or not that's gonna be incredibly relevant to you. Now, in terms of the calibration, out of the box, it's not too bad in SDR sRGB, but it's not gonna be clamped to the correct sRGB color space. So with some simple tweaking, I was able to correct that and RGB balance it as well. Now, normally I lock this stuff behind my Patreon, but you know what? I think I'm gonna make this one free over on the Patreon for everybody if you want to know the best settings for this display. Now, in HDR, it is unfortunately a little bit of a mess. Now, the RGB balance isn't too bad, but it does have some serious problems on the EOTF curve. Now, this is important because, especially when you look at the bottom of that EOTF curve, what you're gonna notice is that it is wildly over darkening shadows. That is a huge problem, as you're going to lose a lot of shadow detail, which of course means you're just not gonna see some things that you would normally be able to see. Now, I was able to correct this somewhat, but you either have to choose between a little bit of shadow detail being lost or a little bit of shadow detail being over brightened. And this does definitely need some firmware updates. Now, in terms of the color volume, as I mentioned earlier, you know what, in SDR, it's gonna be great, but in HDR, these WOLED monitors certainly have some problems, and that's still the case here. We're talking around 71% DCI-P3 versus the potentially 100% plus you would see on Quantum Dot OLED. And that's just a trade-off you're gonna have to make for potentially maybe overall higher brightness if they push the panel hard enough. And that's the question. have they done it? And my first impressions when it comes to the brightness is it's definitely good enough for monitor usage. I'm glad to see that with this new micro lens array technology, which is just a bunch of lenses on top of the subpixels refocusing the light so that it can get you more brightness at the cost of zero power increase. Yeah, they've been able to get some really good brightness levels there for full screen. However, honestly, this is just not bright enough for impactful HDR. It gets absolutely destroyed by LG's own TVs, so don't expect to be seeing any just super bright wowing HDR pictures, which is a little bit disappointing. As you can see here in the peak window brightness at a D65 white point, while it does actually bring in higher brightness than all the 32-inch quantum dot OLEDs and even their own 42-inch LG C4, well, when you compare it to say a 55-inch quantum dot OLED TV or 55-inch LG G4 MLA OLED TV using the same MLA technology as the 32-inch pretty much, well, yeah, it gets absolutely annihilated. We're talking about roughly 2 times the brightness on the TVs, and I get that they probably don't want to push them quite as hard because they're scared of burn-in, but I feel like they're really limiting this thing and holding it back. I'd like to see it reach 1,000 plus nits in a 10% window to take full advantage of this new technology and really separate it in terms of brightness and image quality versus the 32-inch quantum dot OLEDs. In fact, as you can see here, again, at a D65 white point in a real game, Baldur's Gate 3, well, you'll notice that this even falls short of the 42-inch LG C4, which is not using their new MLA technology. This is a very old WOLED technology by today's standards, and it definitely should not be outpacing this monitor, so that is a little bit disappointing, and I'd like to see some third-party manufacturers push this panel much harder to take full advantage of this new, really good technology. And in fact, as you can see here, it's basically no brighter than the 32-inch quantum dot OLEDs, and that's a problem because those OLEDs can actually give you brighter colors. So which one of these is actually brighter is going to be highly dependent on the scene that you're looking at. So if you're buying this for higher brightness, I'm sorry, you're just not going to get it, at least on its current firmware. And that brings me to another issue, near black performance. This thing crushes shadow detail like crazy. Out of the box here, you can see in SDR it's missing a ton of shadow detail, and in HDR, where did it go? There basically is no shadow detail. And I gotta be honest with you guys, this is the worst that I have ever seen out of any display in my life thus far. I've never seen a display that basically just doesn't have shadow detail in one of these tests. That's really not good. Now, I was able to improve upon it a little bit, but without raising shadow details in certain ranges too much, this is the best you can get, which is, yeah, that's pretty disappointing that there's gonna be quite a bit of detail missing there. But what about gaming? I mean, the main feature of this thing is the 480Hz mode. And I gotta report to you guys, it's actually incredible. I mean, the motion performance you get out of this thing is insane, and the latency likewise is gonna be a little bit better. Now, do keep in mind when we're talking about 480Hz versus 360Hz or even 240Hz, we're talking sub 2 or 1 millisecond differences between those types of refresh rates. So don't expect to go from bronze or rookie all the way up to some diamond level player because you have extra refresh rate, but it can potentially make a really good player that little tiny bit better if they can take full advantage of that extremely high frame rate, which you are going to need a monster CPU to lock those types of frames in modern games, even esports titles. But regardless, 24 milliseconds at 480Hz. Do keep in mind 1080p on a 32-inch screen, which, by the way, does not look too good. And even if you do shrink it down, it actually even looks a little bit worse. So yeah, it's not gonna look good regardless. I think it has something to do with the way that it scales, but you do get the lowest total system latencies that I've seen out of any 4K monitor thus far. But let's take a look at the motion performance. This is the main reason as to why you would want a high refresh rate, especially on OLED, which can take full advantage of these really high refresh rates. And I gotta say, guys, really, really impressive when it comes to that motion performance. I mean, as you can see here, 120 Hz on this monitor looks pretty decent, still better I'd say than 144 Hz on mini LED, but then at 240 Hz it's significantly better, and you can start to make out some of that text. You can really read it. It's better than 60 Hz. But then you move to 480 Hz, and I gotta be honest, I have never seen such a good picture in motion. That is genuinely, and I know I've said this a lot, but this time I mean it, guys. This is really, really close to that example screenshot, and that is the end game goal for motion performance. Now, it could be improved a little bit, and I think true end game would technically be 1000 Hz, but I do think this is that good enough territory where it really, really looks good in motion if you can take advantage of it and you're okay with 1080p. But we do have to talk about the text clarity and the finish. Now, I will say this new subpixel arrangement certainly does make for far better text clarity in those best case scenarios, because they've moved now to RGWB, whereas before it was green, red, white, blue, which did make for some pretty bad text, especially against grays. And here that's been improved absolutely massively. And this is by far the best looking text that I've seen on an OLED in ideal conditions. And why do I keep saying ideal conditions? Well, because as good as the new subpixel arrangement is, unfortunately, it's covered up by a, let's be honest, horrendous matte coating. Now, my opinion on matte coatings is that it's a terrible choice for a premium display overall, because matte coatings can not only make OLED displays, which are meant to be showing true black, somewhat washed out in brighter environments, but it can also lead to a reduction in perceived clarity as well as a reduction in vibrancy. And that clarity especially is a big problem. It really, really can make a great 4K image look rather blurry and grainy, which is incredibly disappointing to see out of such an expensive and premium display. That just should not be paired with a display like this. And to make matters worse, this is by far one of the worst looking matte coatings I've seen in my life. It looks insanely grainy and oily to a point where, especially if you pull up some white screens, it just looks absolutely awful, and it triggers some sort of crazy OCD that I didn't know I had. I just could not use this monitor doing spreadsheets or something like that against white screens for a significant amount of time. And you might be thinking, well, in games it won't be a big issue, but it's still a big issue, especially in HDR, where the brighter the screen gets, the more noticeable that light refraction becomes, where the light is bouncing between the matte coating before it reaches your eyes, making for a blurrier and oily, grainy image. Again, really, really disappointing to see that, and it takes that text clarity and ends up making it look kind of blurry and bad. So it's just so disappointing to see that they've chosen once again to put a horrendous matte coating on this. And for the love of God, LG, could you stop doing this to your premium displays? I would love to see one of these things with a Gorilla Glass coating or literally anything else than matte. You have TVs that you make yourself with multiple different coating options from the C series to the G series that all look absolutely incredible. You get all of the benefits of a glossy coating, and they don't have anywhere near the issues with ambient light that Quantum.OLED has. So when you already have such good coatings that you make, why would you go and ruin it? It makes absolutely no sense. And it takes a display which is supposed to be one of the best looking displays. This is why you're buying it, and makes it no longer one of the best looking displays. I cannot believe that LG has done this, and I saw some people saying that it's been improved versus previous years, and in some ways that is true. It does seem a little bit less hazy, but it still looks just as grainy and oily as it ever has. So I really don't consider this to be much of an improvement, and they have got to ditch the matte coating and use something like what they're using on their G series, which also has the same MLA technology. It looks great, and it does have pretty decent ambient light handling. But let's talk about the viewing angles and uniformity. And I will say that this has been a major issue on previous OLED TVs especially. I mean, you look at the C4 and that thing has some major issues with green and magenta tinting when viewed off angle. But these new MLA panels have nowhere near the same problems. They're not quite as clean as Quantum.OLED, but overall, it actually is pretty dang good, so no major complaints here, and great to see that that's been improved. Now, the sound is serviceable if you do want to use it. It does lack some body, but I'll be honest, it is actually better than some really bad bookshelf speakers. I'd rather have a slightly cleaner sound that lacks some body and some bass than an overly muffled and heavy bass sound that has no detail. So could certainly be better, but hey, you know what? Does the job. And the menu and firmware is pretty good, but it lacks some features, and there was no major VRR flickering that I noticed. However, if you have some really wildly fluctuating frame rates in dark environments, any OLED will flicker. So be sure to cap your frame rate to something reasonable. And the last thing I do want to mention is that I did unfortunately see some vertical banding on gray screens. Now, normally I've been able to fix this on WOLED by simply doing a pixel refresh. However, I couldn't do it with this model, so be aware, depending on your luck, you might get stuck with a model like me that has unfixable vertical banding on gray screens, something that Quantum.OLED has absolutely no issues with. So there you have it, guys. There's a ton of things about this monitor to like for sure. That 480Hz mode is very impressive, and certainly the brand new sub-pixel arrangement is a massive improvement, not only over older versions, but also significantly improved even versus Quantum.OLED. So the panel itself, I actually love. However, the monitor, well, there was just some design choices made and pricing choices that are just absolutely astoundingly bad. I mean, first of all, the matte coating, let's be honest, absolutely ridiculous to put a matte coating on a display over $1,000. This is a premium display and it deserves to have premium clarity, premium vibrancy, and all the other benefits that come with a glossy display. But to make matters worse, even if you can look beyond that, it had some firmware problems. I mean, not only could it not properly track EOTF, but it also had vertical banding on gray screens. And of course, because it's WOLED, it does have inferior color volume when it comes to comparisons between it and Quantum.OLED. And finally, it had some insane black crush like I haven't seen on any other display before. You're just missing a ton of details. You couple all those negatives with the fact that they're trying to charge roughly $1,400 for this display, and I just really don't know who this monitor is for. If you're someone who wants one of the best quality monitors on the market, well, this isn't it. The matte coating really harms the image, and Quantum.OLED has superior color volume, and this doesn't even have much, if any, advantage when it comes to brightness either, which is absolutely ridiculous considering the panel itself is actually capable of getting much brighter. It seems like they're not pushing it hard enough. And then if you're someone who maybe you're going, you know what, I don't want the best quality 4K. The 4K on this is good enough even with the matte coating. I'm more interested in the 480Hz. Well, that is a bit of a stronger argument, as the 480Hz mode on this monitor is actually incredibly clear in motion. However, even for those people, I would urge you to just simply wait for the 27-inch 1440p models, because I'm just not sure there's going to be a whole lot of appetite for 1080p at 32 inches. And while you can shrink it down, it did actually look even worse than at 32 inches. Probably something to do with the way that it's scaling on the monitor. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, it's just not gonna look too good. And if you just wait a little bit longer, there will be 1440p 27-inch 480Hz models, and I just think you're gonna be a lot more satisfied with those versions. And even if you can't run the 1440p on there, I do think that you'll be more satisfied with 1080p on that smaller screen versus on 32 inches. So yeah, it's a really cool monitor in concept, but it's just way too pricey, has too many problems, and just doesn't look as good, unfortunately, as the Quantum.OLED monitors. So I simply cannot recommend this monitor to anyone. I think in order to do so, not only would they have to fix their firmware, but it would have to drop all the way down from $1,400 to probably somewhere around $600 to $800, somewhere in that range, simply because it's being outclassed by a ton of different monitors in different ways. And again, the only thing I think worth buying about this monitor is the 480Hz mode. I would suggest just picking up a $900 or $950 MSI Quantum.OLED instead. You'll get a better picture quality, better colors, and save a ton of money. We are talking about roughly $500. I don't know how people are recommending this at its price. That is absolutely insane considering the amount of problems that this thing has right now. And as reviewers, I think we really need to start asking ourselves the question, honestly, when we get a product, especially when it's given to us for free, which this was not. I purchased this myself, but when that happens, when you're gifted something, I think we really need to ask ourselves, would we actually buy this with our own money? And if the answer is no, if it has too many problems or isn't impressing you enough, maybe we shouldn't be recommending these monitors, because quite frankly, I'm really shocked that people are recommending this in its current state, and I think there needs to be more sufficient testing done on displays like this before we start giving our recommendations. I mean, guys, listen, I gain nothing by telling you not to buy this monitor. I really wish this was good. I want this to be good, and in fact, there will be Gorilla Glass versions of this coming out in the future with potentially far higher brightness, hopefully good firmware, and also a better clarity coating that I think will be really good, but I just simply can't recommend this. And again, I'm not gaining anything. If I was able to tell you to go buy this, I could make affiliate money by putting it in the description below. LG would be happy if they saw this video, and people who bought this monitor would also be happy. But by me telling you not to buy this, it's just nothing but negatives for me. LG is probably gonna have a bad opinion on me and might not even send me any stuff in the future if they ever were to begin with. And also buyers who have already purchased this display, and especially who are unwilling or unable to return it at this point in time, are just gonna be really angry about this video. They're gonna be sending me absolutely ridiculous messages or posts on my videos. They'll probably start hate threads over on forums because they're mad that I told them that I don't recommend this monitor, and they're gonna try and discredit me. So it just is nothing but negatives for me. The only thing that I gain is making sure that people who are willing to hear criticism are able to spend their money on things that are actually worth their money and get better displays. And at the end of the day, guys, whether LG likes me or people who bought this monitor like me, that is far more important. I would much rather tell you the truth and have people hate me than tell you that something is good when it just isn't. I think that's incredibly immoral, and I don't think that has any place in the reviewer space.